With the lead story in the New York Times this morning, or at least on my phone as I was coming in, was Ukraine all over again, and what's going on there. These group of so-called pro-Russian folks. I say so-called because I don't know the story. I want to ask Stephen Cohen about this in just a moment. Had seized a couple of government buildings in a couple of cities, apparently, and then the Ukrainian government sent the troops in and dislodged them, and now there's all this conversation about. In fact, actually, Victoria Jones in the news report here on our program yesterday was saying that, the word that she got from Jay Carney at the White House was that some of these people are, quote, paid provocateurs, and then on the other side you've got the Russians saying, no, it's Blackwater, and it's like, what's going on here? So the guy who really understands this stuff better than anybody I've ever met in my whole entire life is Professor Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus at New York University and Princeton University, contributing editor to The Nation magazine, author of the book Soviet Fates and Lost Alternatives, From Stalinism to the New Cold War. Of course, you can read his work over at thenation.com. His most recent piece is titled Flawed U.S. Policy Led to This New Cold War. And Professor Cohen, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. This flawed U.S. policy led to this new Cold War. Was this first published in The Nation?
Yeah, actually, the title is a little more lyrical. It's called Cold War Again, Who's Responsible?
Oh, okay.
But it does argue at the core that American policy over the last 20 years has led to this crisis. Not only, but that's been the driving force of this worst crisis with Russia, I think, since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's getting worse by the day.
So what is the popular narrative that we're reading in the New York Times and the American press, and what is the popular narrative that is being perceived in Russia, and where does the truth lie between the two?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, part of the problem is, let me back up. The argument that I make in the Nation article is that leading up to, let's say, the annexation of Crimea a couple of weeks ago in March, you had two completely conflicting narratives, the American narrative and the Russian one. The American narrative said all this is about democracy and sovereign choice and economic prosperity and joining Europe. And the Russians don't want any of that, so they did bad things in Ukraine, and then they seized Crimea. The Russian narrative is the United States has moved its economic, military, and political power toward Russia over the last 20 years, since the end of the Soviet Union, spearheaded by NATO expansion, but not only. All these NGOs promoting democracy have been very deeply involved in Ukrainian and Russian politics. And about 10 years ago, Putin said, we don't like any of this, but believe you me, we have two red lines. One is the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, and we, the West, crossed that line, and we had a brief war in 2008. And the other, said Putin, is Ukraine. Now, he thinks we've crossed the line in Ukraine because he believes that all of this, beginning back in November, when the European Union offered Ukraine a so-called economic prosperity or partnership agreement, in which the elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, did not sign and was overthrown by protests in the streets, that according to the Russians, all of this is about taking Ukraine out of Russia's realm of influence, where it's been for 300 years, and attaching it not only to Europe, but to NATO. If I had to choose between the two narratives, I would say the Russian narrative is closer to the truth, which will result in me being called a Putin apologist, but for a historian, such as I am, facts are facts. And as Casey Stengel used to say, you could look this up.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely clear. Now, what we have today is the aftermath, don't we? And it's gotten more dangerous. We have all these moving parts. First of all, Washington is not telling the truth. The government in Kiev is not telling the truth. And the Russians aren't telling the whole truth. And we're supposed to figure out where the truth is among them. But it's very, very dangerous because here's what you've got. The Russians have had about, nobody knows exactly, 20 to 40,000 troops on the eastern border, on its western border with eastern Ukraine. They've been there about a month. And there are various accounts of whether they're in a menacing operational posture or they're not, but they're there. Meanwhile, there is a lot of talk and maybe some reality already of moving NATO troops, which had not been forward-based east of Berlin, east of Germany, toward Russia, to the Baltics, to Romania, to Poland, and possibly to western Ukraine, which would be a catastrophe. Now, while all that's going on, you suddenly have secessionist, pro-Russian secessionist movements seizing municipal legislatures in 4 or 5 large cities in eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian.
Right along the Ukrainian-Russian border, more or less.
That's exactly right, Donetsk and the others. Now, the White House says, this isn't authentic. This isn't really locals there. These are paid Russian agents. And the Russians are answering, well, Kiev is sending troops to take back the buildings, and traveling with them are these American mercenary, who used to be called Blackwater, now it's called Greystone or something. And meanwhile, everybody's wearing a black mask. You can see them on TV. It's not a good sign when toughs are running around in masks, don't want their face to be shown. So, you've got a lot of tails wagging the dog being the potential of war with Russia, a lot of tripwires. And the puzzlement to me is the Russians have made what I think is a reasonable set of proposals for the beginning of negotiation. By beginning of negotiation, it means we compromise, they compromise, and all the rest. But for some reason, publicly, the White House has not accepted that invitation to sit down and negotiate. Now, they may be doing it secretly, Tom. We never know the full story. And if they are negotiating secretly, good. But the way Kerry spoke today, really, I think, unbefitting to a Secretary of State, calling the Russians liars and provocateurs, and yet he wants to go and talk to the Russian foreign minister. It doesn't look like the Obama administration is in a negotiating mode, though it says it is on one level.
Mm-hmm. Now, when Victoria first, she's a reporter with the Talk Radio News Service and comes on every day and just gives us and she was at the White House and was sharing the story with me yesterday. And the view was it looks like maybe Russia's going to grab some more territory from Ukraine. And my response was, and this is based on no insights like you have, just kind of common sense, I think. Russia had a major chunk of their fleet in Crimea. It's a strategic, militarily and strategically, it is critical to them. And so seizing that makes sense, or collaborating with the folks there to do the separation or whatever.
Right.
But taking any more of Ukraine doesn't make sense to me. It seems more like a provocation. It almost seems like this is internal Ukrainian politics that is going to spill out over into Russia and into NATO.
Well, you've made a fundamentally smart point that doesn't emit from Washington. Not all of this, but the situation that's been created by the European Union's move on Ukraine back in November that triggered all of this, it's now being driven, you're absolutely right, by internal Ukrainian realities. Put it like this. Back in November, there was one Ukrainian state, but there were at least 2 Ukrainian countries. The state was never stable.
Right.
And now the state has basically fallen apart. And you have a kind of de facto at the moment partitioning of Ukraine, one half leaning to Russia, one half to Europe. So the question is, what should be done now?
Well, let's pick that up in just a second. We're talking with Professor Stephen Cohen, writing for The Nation magazine.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
You can read his most recent article over at thenation.com. We'll be right back with more of Dr. Cohen. So, Dr. Cohen, kind of fundamental to my analysis of this was the assumption that Russia had and needed Crimea.
Yeah.
Had a legitimate strategic military interest and needed Crimea. And and that probably not only did they not have a legitimate need for the rest of Ukraine other than as a neutral buffer zone, but that taking over more of it or nibbling away cities would just be a mess for Putin. Does that analysis?
No, I think that's absolutely right. I would go farther about Crimea. Crimea's attachment to Russia is not only military, it's emotional, historical, political. It was always in Russia. And it was a kind of administrative fluke that during the Soviet era, Khrushchev said, let's just put it in Ukraine. Nobody ever thought Ukraine would be apart from Russia. But Crimea and its history is kind of like the Alamo to us. It would be like we gave the Alamo back or something.
Right.
I mean, it just evokes all these historical myths, many of them military, not only, but about glory. But look, let's stop and think. Putin was being pushed hard at home to bring Crimea into the Russian Federation. And the argument was, it is in the Russian Federation. It's only kind of flukily, administratively, it's in Ukraine. Bring it in. It protects our fleet. God knows what's going to happen as a result of this revolution or whatever in Kiev. But what's being argued here in the United States now, that he has a larger ambition, which is to take the whole of eastern Ukraine. That is not the goal in Moscow. But if it comes to it, they will do it if they're pushed. They're not in a retreating, compromising mood. They feel they've been come at by us for 20 years. But stop and think. Putin understands, I think as well as you and I do, that if Russian troops enter eastern Ukraine, NATO troops will probably enter western Ukraine. Stop and think of what that means. That is like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yep. They're eyeball to eyeball, nobody in a mode to blink, and it could come to war. Putin has no interest in that. It's the last thing in the world he would want. Therefore, what he wants is stability. And the Russians have put forward a proposal that they think will stabilize Ukraine. I don't know if it will or it won't, but it's worth discussing. And the crucial point goes back to what you said before, that this is now being driven by internal conflicts in Ukraine. The Russians are saying that in such a divided country, divided historically, politically, religiously, economically, ethnically, linguistically, every conceivable division, you need a federal constitution, not a unitary constitution. For example, at the moment, all the governors are appointed by the central government in Kiev. They're not elected locally or regionally. The Russians are saying you'll never have unity like this. So we have to have, and they even point to the United States. They don't understand our union very well.
Right, but they know how different the South is from Boston.
That's right. But, I mean, they kind of don't have an idea of all the problems. After all, we fought a civil war to keep the Union together. These are not easy to do. Yeah. But the point is, they're saying, look, the United States has a union, and they give the states elect the governors, and they have some tax authority, and et cetera, et cetera. That's right. What Ukraine should have.
Okay, let's pick this up right after the break. It'll just be a second. Professor Stephen Cohen is with us. Professor Emeritus at New York University and Princeton University contributing editor to The Nation magazine, thenation.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Dr. Stephen Cohen, Professor Stephen Cohen on the line with us. His new piece in The Nation about how our flawed policy led to the new Cold War. I'm sorry, I don't have the original article in front of me, so I don't have the correct title. What is the title?
It's called Cold War Again, Who's Responsible?
Great, thank you. And you can read it over at thenation.com, of course. And you were saying that, first of all, that now Ukraine is kind of two countries, one, and two, that President Putin has proposed a sort of federalist constitution for Ukraine, and where are we at in this? And do you want to elaborate on those before you continue?
Well, I mean, Americans know the difference between a unitary state, that is where all power is vested in the central government, and a federal or a union state where the components, whether we call them precepts or regions or states, They have their own powers.
Yeah, I think most Americans don't understand that distinction.
Well, but we have a Supreme Court that sorts this out periodically. But we've lived with it all our lives, all our history. And the Russians are saying Ukraine is so badly divided that if you want to keep it one Ukraine, you need to move in that direction. Now, the Russophobic lobby in Washington is saying it's a trick. Because what the Russians want to do is give the eastern pro-Russian provinces of Ukraine something akin to autonomy. So they can live by the rules of Russia and not by the rules of Kiev, the central government.
Right.
But here's the thing, Tom. You and I know this. Just because bad people sometimes associate themselves with a good idea doesn't mean the idea is bad. There are people in Russia who see in this idea of a federative Ukraine a chance to reassert Russia's authority over the whole of Ukraine. But other Russians don't see it like that. And many Ukrainians agree that you're going to need a federative Ukraine if you're going to remain a single state. But that raises another question. If that doesn't work, and the only alternative is war, civil war or war between East and West, then the third option is a partitioned Ukraine, 2 Ukrainian states. Now, that is discussed kind of secretly, like some kind of forbidden drug. But it is being discussed in Europe, I would assume in Washington, if anybody's awake there, and certainly in Moscow. Would that be the worst outcome? Because what you'd end up with is a Western Ukraine that would return from whence it came, Lithuania, Poland, and those regions of Eastern Europe.
Right. And
Eastern Ukraine would return where it lived for 300 years, to Russia. Would that be stability? Would everybody be satisfied with half? Would Ukrainians themselves accept that? I don't know, but I mean, it's better than war.
And would Kiev end up like a divided city like Jerusalem, where
that's interesting, because one of the objections to this is when you hit central Ukraine, it's such a mishmash of ethnicity that nobody would know where to draw the borders.
Right.
But that would be a negotiation and compromise. Economics are very important here. Eastern Ukraine is completely embedded in the Russian economy. It's where the heavy industry, the military-industrial complex is, space components are made there. People say, well, that's why Russia wants to keep it. That's so. But where is Ukraine going to sell that stuff to if they don't sell it to Russia? There's no market for that other than Russia. So Eastern Ukraine and Russia are linked fundamentally by economics. And I haven't even mentioned, Tom, the most poignant part of this. There are tens of millions of mixed Ukrainian-Russian marriages.
Mm.
I mean, this is conjugal, so to speak. It's not only political and economic.
Right.
But, I mean, families are caught in this horrible... And they don't understand why they have to get a visa to go to Russia or to come to Ukraine. And the truth is they shouldn't have to.
Yeah.
So this is really a profound crisis driven by historical divisions and provoked, I believe, by unwise European, American attempts to draw Ukraine to NATO. I think that was the underlying motive. Mm. And it's led to this.
Yeah. So
but there is a way out. I mean, the point is there's a way out. I mean, and the Russian proposals are somewhat more complicated than I mentioned, but I think Russia would even be willing, that's just my guess, based on some things, that if there was a fair settlement to their mind, they'd allow Crimea, though it would remain in the Russian Federation, to have special economic relations with the mainland, because Crimea is a peninsula, have economic relations with the mainland of Ukraine, and a visa-free regime, maybe a tax-free regime. I mean, I don't think it's in their interest to isolate Crimea completely from Ukraine. But at the moment, everybody's so angry, and it's been so militarized, that the diplomacy needed seems not to be there.
What, if from an American point of view, what, or even from a world citizen point of view, the risk of war going beyond Ukraine?
Yeah.
We've had this conversation before. Are we at a World War I moment? Has the clock gotten closer to midnight or farther away? We have just a minute left.
I think we're ticking toward midnight, and I think there's even a worse scenario. The Russian army is in much better shape now than it was 10 years ago. But NATO has the conventional advantage, and Russia has said it would use tactical nuclear weapons if it was threatened. And I do not take that as an idle boast. We in the United States do not have a no-first nuclear strike doctrine. We've never adopted that. The Russians had one once. But they're now saying that if they're overrun by conventional forces, they will resort to the unthinkable. I don't think we want to mess with this. I really don't.
Wow. This is like the monkey that's got his hand in the jar and doesn't want to let go of the peanuts, you know.
Or some body part.
Yeah, yeah. We had to back away from this thing. This is
and it's too bad that the American media, which is good on a lot of things, has such a phobia about Russia and Putin that they really can't tell two sides to the story. That's all they need to do is just tell both sides.
Well, that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because there's so much jingoism going on. Dr. Stephen Cohen, you can read his new piece over at thenation.com. Sir, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Tom.
It's always great talk. It's always an honor. We'll be back.